report that came out yesterday is that if Campos comes in, they'd be willing to give him, I'm sure any sporting director, and a further £260 million over the next 2 windows. Lots to discuss around Chelsea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think let's start with the sporting director, which is going to be a key indicator of the direction that Chelsea are heading. And as I exclusively reported a few days back, the kind of mystery name that is in very advanced talks is, ironically, given last night, Salzburg's sporting director, Christoph Freund. And the reason for that, as Todd Boehly has hinted when speaking at a conference in New York, is because he's a big fan of the Red Bull model. And this is the first real indicator, I think, of the sustainable part of Chelsea Football Club. So as I've said many times, Chelsea were surprised by the lack of data that they inherited and equally bemused by the structure at which the data that they do have is filtered throughout the entire club, particularly that relationship between the academy and the first team. And then Chelsea have always had kind of relatively formal relationships with certain clubs like Vitesse, where they can loan out players. And there's a history of them being utilised through Armando Broja, for example, and Mason Mount as well. But what Boehly wants to do is build a model from the academy up. And why do I say sustainable? Because when you do that, you have 2 opportunities to win. The first is that you get talent young and at decent value, and they become superstars in the first team. And you need to create clear pathways to do that. And then the second win is if things don't work out, you usually have sell-on value. And in order to provide that structure, I think Boehly looks at Red Bull and says, what if we either formalized more arrangements with global clubs like the City Group, or we even bought other clubs? And I know that they're looking in both Portugal and Brazil in the long term. And then suddenly Chelsea becomes part of a group or a model. And in doing so, I think that Boehly thinks that that will allow Chelsea to modernise and compete with the City Group. And then ironically, within that model, they'll take the framework of the City Group, but then the mentality of Liverpool's recruitment model. And he sees that as the best of both worlds, because Liverpool are data-led, they're sustainable, it's decision by numbers, of which the coach is only one part. So then if he leaves, however much autonomy he or she had, there is still that protection for the club. And that, I think, is why, even though Kyle McCauley has come in, they want to bring in a sporting director and possibly a technical director to make sure that if for any reason, however long Potter stays for, he changes for any eventuality, they're not then having to build the model once again from scratch. And that is just very sensible. And Freund has had advanced talks with Chelsea. He refused to rule out moving. He said that Chelsea is a huge club. It's in transition. The talks started when Chelsea inquired about Benjamin Sesko, even though they were not successful in getting that particular player. And Boehly wants a sporting director, ideally, that is used to working within a model. So there are other candidates. Paul Mitchell is one of them at Monaco. He's very intent on taking the role, but Freund is more data-driven and has worked within that Red Bull group. And then Campos is a bit of a red herring, because contractually, even though he's technically freelance, he cannot work for PSG and Chelsea simultaneously. So he would either have to buy himself out of his PSG contract to advise Chelsea, or who knows, potentially be their new sporting director if they don't agree a deal with Freund, or alternatively, he would have to try and somehow convince PSG that his role, if he was to only advise Chelsea, would not impinge upon his day-to-day at PSG. And my understanding from PSG is they feel this is all just Campos PR, the same with Manchester United and the links there. It's all about him getting in the media. They're not very happy about it, and PSG feel that Campos is going nowhere. And if they are to be believed and Campos is going nowhere, then contractually he will not be allowed to join Chelsea in any capacity. So it's quite problematic. It's certainly true that Boehly has spoken to Campos as well, and it's important to keep stressing with the sporting director that there are multiple candidates. But right now, I would say that Freund is the most advanced. Freund is leading the race. He is the favourite at this point. And the fact that he said, who knows what will happen in the coming, and here's the key phrase, weeks or months. Weeks is a very strange phrase or word to use because it suggests that something is more imminent and close. Now, this was said to Sky Sports Austria. Things can be lost in translation, but it tallies with what I reported a couple of days ago, that Chelsea had been working on one name quite secretly. They wanted to keep it under wraps. That name is Freund, and it's far more advanced than people realise. So let's see what happens over the coming weeks. Graham Potter and Carl McCauley still need to sign off on the sporting director, and Potter will speak to Freund and possibly some of the other candidates as well over the next 48 hours or so. And then Chelsea hope to lock in a candidate and make a final decision. And then the only advantage of Campos is that he could still come in with Freund, or if he was to be sporting director over 2 windows, it might give Chelsea the opportunity to still wait for Michael Edwards, who was their original number 1 choice. So they're working fast. They're looking to get a name locked in over the coming weeks, certainly by the end of the month. And then it's a case of waiting out things like gardening leave and any contractual commitments that stop whoever the successful candidate is coming in immediately. But come what may, Chelsea will have a sporting director in place ready for the January transfer window.
And you know what? Listening to what you said there is quite interesting, and also like reading some of the comments at the same time, which I like to do. I think the Campos situation, what's really interesting is when you read the stories, and obviously I've seen your tweets and your exclusives, that there is the potential for multiple people to potentially come into Chelsea and help run. Whoever they're a sporting director, it could be that Paul Mitchell might be, as you mentioned, might work underneath Christoph. I think what's interesting about that is I saw people on Twitter say, no, he wouldn't work under him. They all do the same job. I'm like, if you pay someone enough money, they'll take a quote unquote more junior role, as long as the money's right and they, a certain amount of responsibility is delegated to them. And I kind of feel like there's a comment here that came through from Twisted, one of our viewers, and he kind of said that it took nearly a decade for FSG's model to take effect. And I think people, and it did, but history shows us that you can piggyback upon other people's methodology and get to a cleaner, quicker result faster, because the SFGs of this world, the Man Cities of this world, they've laid down the pathway. They've shown you what works and what doesn't. So you don't have to make those same mistakes, as it were. If people, if suddenly a new billionaire wants to start a space program, like the likes of, it took Elon Musk a lot quicker to create a space program than it did NASA. That's because they've got all the data that NASA created to piggyback on to get to that stage faster. And I think that people have got to understand that. And I see a lot of disrespect towards Todd Boehly. Maybe it's because he's American. Maybe it's because he speaks a little bit too much to the media and kind of airs the dirty linen in public, as it were, and shares those views. And some of them are seen as radical. The All-Stars game thing has triggered people. And all I saw yesterday was basically no more Americanisms in our sport. And I just thought, sponsors on shirts, boxes at stadiums. But Gary Neville calling out Americanisms, where his signature show is literally called Monday Night Football. I just find the whole thing to be ironic. We've taken games away from 3:00 on Saturdays and spread them over the course of from Fridays through till Monday nights to televise and make more money, which is an Americanism. It wasn't an English idea. It goes against all the traditions of our sport. We got rid of back passing. We added yellow cards to games as examples. We brought in VAR and technology along those lines. We've done so many things in football which are adaptations of our original game. I do find the way Todd Boehly's being treated really distasteful and disrespectful, almost lumping every American and every American owner into one group, saying, you're all bad for our game, you're terrible for our game. And I just think to myself, Mike Ashley wasn't bloody English. Wasn't American. The owner that absolutely destroyed and nearly bankrupted and put Leyton Orient out of business, was sold by an English group to, I believe, an Italian group who ruined the club. What's that got to do with America? So yeah, I'm kind of, there are people that can't stand Salford City, Salford FC, whatever they're called, because of the way they've had money pumped into, and they think that's detrimental to the lower pyramids of the game. So I just find, I don't know, the Todd Boehly kind of abuse and attacks at the minute I find strange. He's clearly trying to build a sustainable long-term plan for the club, bringing in some of the best footballing and technical directors in the world. They're spending big money on players, both for the here and now, i.e. Koulibaly's, etc., Raheem Sterling's. They're investing in players for the future. and they're essentially 3 to 4 months into this complete transition, and everyone's moaning that it's not where FSG are now, or it isn't where Man City are, and therefore it's never going to work. It's a very strange time, and I don't like defending my rival clubs, but I just find the whole thing towards Todd Boehly very distasteful, very distasteful.
Yeah, I think that in a nutshell, you nailed it when you referred to the fact that Todd Boehly has spoken quite a bit, and that's very rare for an owner. And he's going to be more in the media glare because he's not just a minority owner. He's also the face of the American consortium. He's the chairman and he's the sporting director. And we don't hear from Newcastle's majority owner, from Manchester City's owner, from the Glazers. And it was the case with Abramovich as well, that he was a very anonymous owner as far as talking about the football club in the media. And I think that it's very refreshing that Todd Boehly is prepared to talk. There's a question as to where and when he should talk and in what capacity, because he's got so many roles. Is he speaking as sporting director when referring to Thomas Tuchel and himself having different ideologies, or does that come from the chairman, or does that come from the majority owner, Clearlake Capital? And lines are blurred a little bit because Chelsea is still building their structure. And then was it right to speak at a conference in New York out the blue in such detail versus doing a club interview or engaging with the fans? But in essence, I think it's refreshing to see any owner this open and transparent, whether you agree with Boehly or not. And it boils down to one key point, which I've seen in the chat as well. Boehly is, to some, talking too much. I think there's going to be a tweet, by the way, of Boehly handshake, Ben Jacobs talks too much. And then that, in a nutshell, tells you that some people just don't like context. They don't like detail, and they don't like the threat of change. And I think that sort of sets up this whole triggering around the All-Star game.